Daniel Cormier versus Jon Jones. Starting with my personal favorite, this has to be the best rivalry of all time. The origins of the beef can be traced back to UFC 121 in October 2010, where Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier first met backstage before the Cain Velasquez versus Brock Lesnar fight. At the time, they had never met before. Jones, a rising star in the UFC, had heard of Cormier's wrestling background, but didn't know much about him personally. Their conversation started friendly, with Jones saying, "I heard you're a great wrestler." Jon later admitted that he had hoped to walk away from the encounter with a new friend. However, at some point, he made an arrogant comment telling Cormier, "I bet I could take you down." While Jones may have meant it as a joke, that didn't sit well with Cormier. Given his extensive wrestling background, having represented the US in the Olympics and being a former world champion, that moment planted the seed for what would become one of the most heated rivalries in UFC history. The tension continued to build when Jon Jones, now the UFC light heavyweight champion, attended the 2011 World MMA Awards. While there, he publicly made it clear that he wouldn't endorse a sponsor if that sponsor also worked with Cormier. This wasn't a one-time thing. Cormier caught wind of Jones's comment and confronted him there in person, making it clear that he didn't appreciate being disrespected. Jon Jones then took to Twitter to mock Cormier's weight, taking jabs at him ahead of his UFC debut. Cormier, who was preparing for his UFC debut, quickly responded, calling Jones out for a fight. It's important to note that at this point the rivalry wasn't even in the same weight class, but luckily that got fixed. When Alexander Gustafsson suffered an injury, Daniel Cormier was brought in as a replacement to fight Jon Jones for the UFC light heavyweight title in 2014. Both fighters were eager for the matchup, with Jones even privately messaging Cormier to express his excitement. A week before the fight at press conference, tensions boiled over, and the two got into a full-blown brawl in front of the media. It was pure chaos. Then both took to Twitter with Jones mocking Cormier's defense, telling him to put an ice pack on his face, while Cormier fired back, telling Jones, "You hit like a girl," and that he could eat those punches all day. As the promotional tour continued, their hatred for each other grew more. At one point, they had to be placed in separate rooms to prevent another altercation. During one interview, Jones straight up threatens Cormier's life.
Try, Jon.
No, I would literally kill you if you spit in my face.
Yeah, let's try that, Jon.
Literally kill you.
Let's try that, Jon.
I'm not saying I would fight you. I said I would kill you if you
Jon,
did some stupid shit.
The fight itself lived up to the hype. Jones and Cormier faced off at UFC 182 in January 2015, with Jones winning by unanimous decision. But the bad blood didn't end there. After his victory, Jones continued to make fun of Cormier, mocking his Olympic wrestling background and saying he knew Cormier would break. He went even further, saying he still didn't respect him and even hoped Cormier was in tears. However, the drama didn't stop there. Just before the fight, it was revealed that Jones had tested positive for cocaine, since cocaine is not banned outside of competition. The fight went on as planned. The feud didn't end after their first fight. Jones faced a series of personal and legal troubles, including a hit-and-run incident involving a pregnant woman, which led to his suspension and the UFC stripping him of the light heavyweight title. With the belt vacant, Cormier stepped in to replace him and fight Anthony "Rumble" Johnson for the championship. He won the fight in the third round via rear naked choke, officially claiming the title. Despite Cormier's success, the rivalry with Jones only intensified. The two continued to trade insults, with Cormier calling Jones a junkie and Jones firing back, claiming he could beat Cormier even after a week of cocaine use. So a highly anticipated rematch was set, but it was ultimately called off when Jones tested positive for multiple banned substances, resulting in another year of suspension. Over the years, the rivalry between Jones and Cormier took several twists and turns, but the animosity between them never truly faded. Cormier needed a rematch just as much as Jones, if not more, because his loss to Jones was constantly brought up. Jones repeatedly mocked Cormier's championship reign, calling his belt imaginary since he never beat him for it, saying in order to be a champion, you have to beat the champion. The fans constantly brought up the only reason Cormier had the belt was because Jon got stripped of it. So the UFC scheduled a long-awaited rematch after their previous one had fallen through. In their fight, Jones stopped Cormier in the third round, completely breaking him. You would think this is where the rivalry ends, but no. 2 weeks after the fight, Jones was flagged for a doping violation, and once his sample tested positive for anabolic steroids, he was stripped of his belt once again. The result was changed to a no contest, and the title was returned to Cormier. Jones continued to take shots at Cormier on social media whenever he had the chance, but Cormier chose to move on. Khabib versus Conor? Another insane one. These two absolutely hated each other's guts. Before their paths crossed inside the octagon, McGregor and Nurmagomedov shared a friendly relationship. In 2015, during McGregor's rise to the top of the featherweight division, he acknowledged Khabib's potential and even predicted that he would become the lightweight champion. At the time, McGregor was focused on dethroning then featherweight champion Jose Aldo, while Khabib was making his way up the lightweight rankings. There was no bad blood, just two elite fighters chasing their respective goals. The first spark of their feud emerged when McGregor began his campaign to become a two-division champion. After defeating Aldo in just 13 seconds at UFC 194, McGregor was scheduled to move up to lightweight to challenge then-champion Rafael dos Anjos at UFC 196. However, dos Anjos pulled out due to injury, and Nate Diaz stepped in as a late replacement. McGregor suffered a shocking submission loss, but avenged it in a rematch at UFC 202. Meanwhile, Khabib was growing increasingly frustrated with the UFC's handling of the lightweight title picture. He was originally offered a fight against Eddie Alvarez for the title, but the UFC chose McGregor instead. This decision angered Khabib, as he felt McGregor was cutting the line despite only having one fight in the division. So Khabib got on Twitter and expressed his frustration. Conor responded with a few words of his own. A couple of weeks later, the two crossed paths backstage at UFC 205, where McGregor faced Alvarez for the lightweight title. A heated altercation occurred, with security needing to separate them. Khabib later described the incident, stating that McGregor was being disrespectful and sizing him up. McGregor went on to defeat Alvarez in dominant fashion, becoming the first fighter in UFC history to hold two belts simultaneously. However, he never defended his featherweight or lightweight titles. Instead, he pursued a highly lucrative boxing match against Floyd Mayweather, so UFC stripped him of the belts. During McGregor's absence from MMA, Khabib continued his dominance. He fought and defeated Michael Johnson at UFC 205, where he infamously told Johnson mid-fight to give up because he deserved the title shot. He later mauled Edson Barboza at UFC 219, cementing himself as the #1 contender. Khabib would go on to do interviews and talk about a possible fight against Conor, in which he said he would easily dominate him. That really rubbed Conor off, and he went off on Twitter. In April 2018, tensions boiled over into one of the most infamous incidents in UFC history. Leading up to UFC 223, Khabib confronted McGregor's teammate Artem Lobov in a Brooklyn hotel for disrespectful comments made in an interview. This encounter set off a chain reaction, causing McGregor and his team of 30 to storm the Barclays Center in search of Khabib. McGregor and his team attacked a bus carrying Khabib and several other fighters, with McGregor throwing a dolly through a window, injuring fighters Michael Chiesa and Ray Borg. Shortly after, Conor and his team could be seen running out of the parking lot with Khabib posting a video asking for his location.
Send me a message, like location, I'm gonna come. Whatever you want, doesn't matter. Ireland, New York, Brooklyn or Moscow, doesn't matter. Tell me.
The incident resulted in McGregor's arrest, multiple charges, and a significant legal battle. McGregor later reached a plea deal avoiding jail time, but further intensifying the rivalry. During all the chaos, Khabib would go on to fight Al Iaquinta for the lightweight title, after Max Holloway pulled out at the last minute. Khabib dominated Iaquinta, winning by unanimous decision. In his post-fight interview, he called out Conor McGregor, saying all he needed was a 30-minute break before he was ready to fight him. Despite the legal drama, UFC President Dana White saw an opportunity. On August 3, 2018, White officially announced that McGregor and Khabib would face off at UFC 229 for the lightweight title. The build-up to the fight was filled with animosity, with McGregor attacking Khabib's character, religion, and family. Khabib, known for his calm demeanor, remained unfazed and promised to humble McGregor inside the cage. On October 6, 2018, the two finally clashed in what was billed as the biggest fight in UFC history. Khabib dominated the fight with his relentless wrestling, eventually submitting McGregor in the 4th round via neck crank. However, the drama didn't end there. Immediately after securing the victory, Khabib jumped over the cage and attacked McGregor's teammate, Dylan Danis, while McGregor fought with Khabib's teammates inside the octagon. The UFC had never seen such post-fight chaos. Both fighters faced suspensions and fines for their roles in the post-fight. Khabib's reputation as one of the most dominant fighters in UFC history was solidified, while McGregor's star power remained intact despite the loss. Khabib moved on with his life and retired in 2020 with an undefeated record, leaving their feud as one of the most intense and unforgettable in MMA history, while Conor still takes shots at Khabib every chance he gets. I would love to see a rematch between these two, but I don't think Khabib is coming out of retirement. Adesanya versus Pereira. The story starts in the world of professional kickboxing, where Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira first crossed paths. Adesanya, born in Nigeria and raised in New Zealand, quickly made a name for himself with his sharp striking skills. On the other hand, Pereira, a powerful Brazilian fighter with indigenous roots, had a tough upbringing. He struggled with alcohol addiction at just 13 years old and worked 12-hour shifts to help support his family. Kickboxing became his way out. Their first fight took place in Glory Kickboxing, where Pereira edged out Adesanya in a closely contested decision. The fight was competitive, with Adesanya showing his technical brilliance, but Pereira's power was too much. A rematch was inevitable, and when they met again, Adesanya looked hungry for victory, dominating much of the fight. However, in a dramatic turn, Pereira landed a devastating left hook that knocked Adesanya out cold. It was a crushing defeat for Adesanya, who now turned his attention to the UFC full-time. He quickly became one of the most dominant fighters in the UFC middleweight division. His striking and ability to control distance made him almost untouchable, and in 2019, he won the middleweight title. He went on to defend it multiple times, building his legacy and earning comparisons to legends like Anderson Silva. Meanwhile, Pereira remained in kickboxing, where he made history by becoming a two-division champion in Glory. Even though he was finding a lot of success, it wasn't nearly as much as Adesanya, and including the money. Their paths would remain uncrossed, but that would change when Adesanya made a comment about Alex in a 2020 interview, saying, quote, "He watches all of my fight, and every time I fight like clockwork, he tries to put something out like, I beat this guy. At the end of the day, no one knows who he is, and he is going to be that guy. When I am world champion, when I am a legend, he's going to be at some pub talking about, I beat that guy one time." And this made Alex transition to the UFC and hunt down Adesanya. Yes, you heard that right. Alex himself admitted Adesanya comments gave him that final push to make that transition. So in 2020, Pereira made the switch to MMA. Within a few fights, he found himself in the UFC. His defining moment came against Sean Strickland, where Pereira once again showed the power of his deadly left hook, knocking Strickland out in the first round. Since Adesanya had already beaten most of the division and defended his belt multiple times, there were no real challengers left. With their history in kickboxing, Dana White saw the perfect opportunity and set up the fight between them. When Adesanya and Pereira finally faced off, it was a chess match. Adesanya controlled most of the fight with his sharp striking and greater MMA experience. He even rocked Pereira at the end of the first round, nearly finishing him. As the fight went on, most people saw Adesanya as the clear winner. But Pereira had an unbreakable will and devastating power. As the fight entered the fifth and final round, Adesanya appeared to be on his way to another successful title defense. However, Pereira, sensing the urgency, unleashed a brutal flurry of punches, forcing the referee to stop the fight. Once again, Pereira had defeated Adesanya, this time taking his UFC title in the process and making the record 3-0. The rivalry couldn't end there. Determined to get his belt back, Adesanya called for an immediate rematch. They met again at UFC 287, and this time, Adesanya delivered a highlight reel knockout. In the second round, he baited Pereira into a false sense of security before landing a devastating right hand that put him out cold, reclaiming his title in spectacular fashion. After this fight, both men went their separate ways. Alex announced he was moving up to 205, while Izzy went on to fight Sean Strickland. Personally, I'd love to see a third fight. If I were Adesanya, I wouldn't be satisfied with how it ended. Record is still 3-1, at least make it 2-1 in the UFC. Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw. The story begins at Team Alpha Male, a gym founded by former UFC fighter Uriah Faber. The team had many talented fighters, but no one had been able to secure UFC gold. That changed when Duane Ludwig took over as head coach. Under his guidance, the fighters improved significantly, going on a 17-fight win streak. However, there were tensions between Ludwig and Faber. Ludwig eventually decided to leave and start his own gym in Colorado, which led to friction between him and Faber. Despite this, one fighter stood out, TJ Dillashaw. He became the first member of Team Alpha Male to win a UFC championship when he defeated Renan Barão in 2014. His victory, however, only escalated tensions at the gym. Ludwig and Faber argued over who was more responsible for Dillashaw's success. When a rematch was set between Dillashaw and Renan Barão, Dillashaw chose to follow Ludwig to his new gym. It felt like a deep betrayal to Faber and the rest of Team Alpha Male. Enter Cody Garbrandt, a promising young fighter also training at Team Alpha Male. He quickly rose through the ranks, making a name for himself with his striking ability and knockout power. Unlike Dillashaw, Garbrandt remained loyal to Team Alpha Male and took Faber's side in the ongoing feud. When Dillashaw officially left the gym, it became personal between him and Garbrandt. Funniest part is in 2015, Conor McGregor was coaching against Urijah Faber on The Ultimate Fighter, a reality TV show produced by the UFC where rising MMA fighters compete for a UFC contract. The show features two teams, each coached by established UFC fighters who train and compete against each other in a tournament-style format. During the season, McGregor famously called TJ Dillashaw a snake in the grass, predicting that he would betray Team Alpha Male. Not long after, Dillashaw left the team, which only added fuel to the fire. Dillashaw lost his UFC bantamweight title to Dominic Cruz in 2016, and a few months later, Garbrandt would eventually dethrone Cruz and become champion. This set the stage for the inevitable showdown between the former teammates. The UFC capitalized on the rivalry by making them opposing coaches on The Ultimate Fighter 25. The season was filled with tension, verbal jabs, and even physical altercations. In one infamous moment, Garbrandt grabs Dillashaw by the throat, showing just how personal this fight had become. Garbrandt also claimed that he had knocked Dillashaw out in a sparring session and even tried selling the footage to TMZ. The fight lived up to the hype. Garbrandt nearly finished Dillashaw in the first round, dropping him with a clean punch. However, Dillashaw recovered and came back strong in the second round, knocking out Garbrandt to reclaim the bantamweight title. The loss devastated Garbrandt, but he immediately demanded a rematch. 9 months later, they met again at UFC 227. This time, Dillashaw made a statement, finishing Garbrandt in the first round. The loss sent Garbrandt's career into a downward spiral. He went on to lose 4 of his next 5 fights, struggling to regain his momentum. After defeating Garbrandt twice, Dillashaw attempted to become a 2-division champion by dropping down to flyweight to face Henry Cejudo. However, he was brutally finished in just 32 seconds. Things got even worse when Dillashaw tested positive for EPO, a banned substance that enhances endurance. He was stripped of his title and suspended for 2 years. This cast a shadow over his victories, including his wins over Garbrandt, leading some to question if those fights were truly legitimate. Covington versus Masvidal. Masvidal and Covington first met at ATT, a prestigious MMA gym in Florida, where Masvidal was already an established fighter. Covington, a talented wrestler from Oregon, joined the gym as part of a recruitment program. The two quickly became best friends, training together and even living under the same roof for a period when Covington was going through personal struggles. Masvidal allowed Covington to crash on his couch, providing him with food and support as he developed his MMA career. The beginning of their fallout stemmed from a financial dispute involving Masvidal's longtime coach, Paulino Hernandez. According to Masvidal, Covington agreed to pay Hernandez 5% of his fight earnings, a handshake deal that Masvidal himself had honored for years. However, as Covington began to make more money, particularly after earning a title shot, he allegedly refused to pay his coach, leading to tension between him and Masvidal. Masvidal saw this as a huge betrayal, especially after everything he had done to help Covington early in his career. His frustration grew as Covington not only refused to pay his debts, but also started trash-talking him in interviews. Covington's new persona as the UFC's biggest trash talker only made things worse, as he began taking personal shots at Masvidal, his family, and his fighting skills. Once close training partners, Masvidal and Covington became bitter enemies. Covington's comments about Masvidal's personal life and children only made things worse. He claimed Masvidal was jealous of his success, while Masvidal saw Covington as a fake, willing to do anything for attention. Things reached a boiling point when Masvidal moved up to welterweight and gained immense popularity after his stunning knockout of Ben Askren in 2019. As their careers aligned in the same division, the UFC capitalized on their feud, setting up a grudge match between the two former friends. The long-anticipated showdown took place at UFC 272 in March 2022. The build-up was as personal as any fight in UFC history, with both fighters exchanging insults and threats leading up to the event. Covington, known for his wrestling-heavy style, dominated most of the fight, controlling Masvidal on the ground and winning via unanimous decision. While Masvidal had moments of success, Including a hard punch in the fourth round that wobbled Covington, he couldn't capitalize enough to secure a win. Despite the clear loss in the octagon, the bad blood didn't end there. Just weeks after their fight, Covington went on a podcast and said that if he ever saw Masvidal on the streets of Miami, he would literally kill him. A few days later, after that video surfaced, Masvidal found out where Covington was and attacked him. Reports say he punched Covington and broke his teeth. This led to Masvidal being arrested and charged with felony battery. He defended his actions by saying Covington kept disrespecting his family and constantly bringing up his kids, even after their fight, which led to the street altercation. Masvidal eventually retired from MMA in 2023 after a few more fights, while Covington stayed active in the welterweight division. Despite their careers going in different directions, their rivalry remains one of the most intense in UFC history. In a recent interview with DJ Vlad, Masvidal said he plans to come out of retirement to fight Covington and settle things once and for all. He just doesn't know when. Silva versus Sonnen. Anderson Silva came into the UFC and quickly became a superstar, destroying everyone in his path and winning the middleweight title. He was already in the GOAT talks. Meanwhile, Chael Sonnen was building his own reputation, not just for his wrestling skills, but for his mouth. Sonnen wasn't seen as a serious threat to Silva at first, but what he lacked in skills, he made up for with non-stop trash talk. He insulted Silva in every way possible, saying he was a terrible PPV draw, that he faked not speaking English, and even made fun of Silva's mentors. By the time UFC 117 came around on August 7, 2010, fans were dying to see if Sonnen could back up his words. Shockingly, he did, at least for most of the fight. Sonnen dominated Silva for almost 5 full rounds, taking him down and beating him up. Silva, known for his striking, had no answer for Sonnen's wrestling. It looked like the biggest upset in UFC history was about to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Silva locked in a triangle armbar with less than 2 minutes left in the fight. Sonnen had no choice but to tap. Silva kept his belt, but his unbeatable aura was gone. Everyone now knew he could be beaten, and Sonnen had become a star overnight. After UFC 117, things got even crazier. Sonnen failed a drug test for having high testosterone levels and was suspended, delaying the rematch. When he returned, he beat Brian Stann with a submission and then won a close decision against Michael Bisping, earning another shot at Silva at UFC 148. Sonnen turned the trash talk up even more before the rematch. He claimed if Silva lost, he had to leave the middleweight division, but if Sonnen lost, he'd leave the UFC. He made things personal when he brought up Anderson Silva's wife, threatening to slap her buttocks if she didn't cook him a medium-rare steak. That pushed Silva over the edge. Normally calm and respectful, Silva lost his cool and unleashed his frustrations during a pre-fight conference call, promising to hand Sonnen a beating unlike any other. He vowed to break his rival's teeth along with every one of his limbs, claiming that by the time he was done with him, Sonnen would be unable to walk out of the octagon under his own power. On July 7, 2012, at UFC 148, the rematch finally happened. Sonnen came out strong again, taking Silva down and controlling the first round. But in the second round, he made a huge mistake. He threw a spinning back fist, missed, and fell to the ground. Silva saw his chance, hit him with a brutal knee to the body, and finished him with punches. The fight was over, and Silva proved he was still the best. After losing to Silva again, Sonnen eventually moved up to light heavyweight, where he got a title shot against Jon Jones, but got destroyed. He later fought in Bellator before retiring. Silva kept fighting in the UFC before moving to boxing, where he even beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Years later, during a press conference Sonnen hosted for Silva's boxing match against Jake Paul, the rivalry officially ended on a friendly note. Silva joked about Sonnen never coming to the barbecue he invited him to after their fight. Sonnen said he never knew if Silva was serious. Little versus Ortiz. Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz started their careers as friends. Both rising stars in the early days of the UFC, they trained together, helped each other prepare for fights, and had a mutual respect. However, as their careers progressed, Liddell emerged as a top contender in the light heavyweight division, while Ortiz had already cemented himself as the division's champion. As Liddell climbed the ranks, their relationship began to deteriorate. Rumors circulated that Liddell was regularly getting the better of Ortiz in training, which led to Ortiz avoiding sparring sessions. When Liddell became the #1 contender for Ortiz's belt, Tito refused to fight him, citing their friendship. However, UFC President Dana White, who was once Ortiz's manager but had since taken Liddell's side, claimed that Ortiz was simply afraid to fight Liddell, knowing he would likely lose. After years of dodging the matchup, The fight was finally booked for UFC 47 in April 2004. The build-up was heated, with both men exchanging insults and Liddell making it clear that he would knock Ortiz out. When they finally faced off, Liddell delivered on his promise, finishing Ortiz with a second-round knockout. Ortiz claimed he had been poked in the eye, but the result stood, and Liddell walked away victorious. Following their first fight, Liddell captured the UFC light heavyweight championship by knocking out Randy Couture. Meanwhile, Ortiz rebounded with several wins, setting up a rematch between the two at UFC 66 in December 2006. This time, the fight was more competitive. Ortiz had improved his wrestling and striking, but Liddell's power proved too much. In the third round, Liddell overwhelmed Ortiz with punches, forcing a TKO stoppage. While Ortiz took the loss with more humility this time, the rivalry remained heated. UFC 66 became the highest-grossing UFC event at that time, proving just how big their feud had become. Following his win over Ortiz, Liddell's career took a downward spiral. He lost his next fight to Quinton Rampage Jackson, losing his title in the process. Over the next few years, Liddell suffered several brutal knockouts, leading to his retirement in 2010. Ortiz also hit a rough patch, eventually leaving the UFC after contract disputes. In 2018, nearly a decade after their last fight, Ortiz and Liddell were booked for a trilogy bout under Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy MMA promotion. Despite being 48 years old and having not fought since 2010, Liddell agreed to fight Ortiz once more. Unlike their first two encounters, this fight was one-sided. Ortiz, still somewhat active in MMA, easily dominated Liddell, knocking him out in the first round. It was a sad sight for fans of the Iceman, as Liddell looked slow and out of shape, clearly past his prime. The fight was widely criticized, with many arguing that Liddell should never have been allowed to fight. After their final fight, Ortiz continued competing in MMA and even dabbled in politics. Liddell, on the other hand, officially retired from fighting and has focused on coaching and personal ventures.